Welcome. Today I have one of my very old, not that old, but very old friends from the search business. I think I know he's got 25 years or something like that. Bill Hunt. So welcome, Bill.
Thanks.
You've probably been in the business longer than me, I think. When did it all start out for you?
So my business school thesis in 1994 was about using the internet to reach overseas markets. So I've been doing it pretty much since then. Yeah, so next year will be almost 30 years.
Wow. Now I feel old.
Yeah, well, we're old.
But we still look good, so that's fine. Yeah, I think you have probably been touching on every single aspect of search and SEO over all those years. I know that we have discussed very often lots of very geeky aspects of the technical side of it, but you also done some amazingly good presentations on keyword research. I remember a couple of them. And of course, now we just had a discussion earlier today about AI and what's going to go on. But one of the things that you have been focusing more on than most, I would say, is Hreflang. So the implementation of multilingual sites. And how did that all start out?
Well, it started way back in the day when I was at IBM. We were having a problem with this cannibalization. So we actually pitched to Google as part of the sitemap protocol a way for us to say, this is my US site, my UK site, my Australian site. So eventually they sort of implemented the tagging, the ability to say, this is my US, UK, Australian site. And I was working with enterprise clients that actually had this problem. And so we found that it wasn't easy to implement it in the page, so we decided to go the XML sitemap route. And big sites, as you know, are overly complicated. So to solve for that complication, we had to build a tool. And so we built Hreflang-builder really to take in the URLs, multiple existing sources, map them to each other, and then from there, be able to put them out in an XML sitemap. So really it was customer driven. They expected us to solve this problem. And that was the only way we could figure out to do it for them at scale.
Yeah. And now, of course, in case some of you that are watching this don't know what I'm about with Hreflang, it is a standard to sort of join together multiple language version of the site. So basically you can tell Google this page in Danish is the same page in Swedish here, in German here, in English here. And if you have multiple versions of an English site, I've been dealing with a lot of clients that have a US English site, UK and Australian. That, of course, if you know anything about search, you know that can create some duplicate content issues and filtering in Google. But with the Hreflang standard, we can tell Google, yeah, this is all in English, but this is specifically for the Americans and this is for the Australians, for the UK people. So it's a very important standard to deal with if you do have multilingual site. And Bill, you also created a wonderful tool, hreflang-builder.com. I will put a link somewhere to it that can help both identify problems with the current implementation, but can also actually generate the correct Hreflang data.
Yep.
And how's that going?
It's going well. We have a number of clients. In some regards, as you're saying, it can be a tough sell because a lot of people don't really understand it. It's an interesting dilemma of who owns this. Is it the SEO because it's a sort of a Google thing? Is it the sales channel? Because again, they're the ones that are the ones challenged with cannibalization. Is it a country problem? And so that's typically a challenge that we have. But otherwise, it's going well. Those that are using it, we just had a company tell us they were having a big cannibalization problem in the Middle East, where exactly as you said, Google said, oh, okay, we took this Arabic website from Dubai or from United Arab Emirates, and we're basically showing that in all the Arab queries in across the region. Once they deployed Hreflang, explicitly telling Google, this is my Saudi, Oman, UAE version, then the correct market was replaced, and they said they had experiencing like a 3,000% increase in visibility, and most importantly, was almost 100% decrease in cart abandonment. So people from Saudi Arabia that came into the website and saw the pricing was for the UAE and would abandon. Those people were staying because now it was, in Saudi pricing instead of UAE. So that's a really good benefit when we see that the right page is showing to the right people, and it fosters that pathway to conversion. And I think, again, that's the problem. People understand an SEO in many cases isn't responsible for conversion. They're responsible for ranking. So who's responsible for conversion? And those are the people, when they get involved, they're the ones that say, okay, we really need this. And when we deploy it, really, really good things can happen.
One thing that most people are not aware of with Hreflang is that it also sort of assigns or copy the authority of pages. And I had my suspicion for years, but then a couple of years ago, I met up with Gary Iles in Barcelona, good event there, and he confirmed it to me that they look at these pages as clusters. So if you have, and it's especially important if you're launching new languages. So basically, if you're launching a new language, maybe on a subdomain or subfolder, whatever it is, especially if it's on a country CLD or subdomain, you're starting out with a site with no authority at all. But then you may have great authority already. So maybe your genes or something that is on one page, that authority can be inherited on these other language sites that you're launching. So it's actually a much faster way to gain the same kind of visibility. So basically, you can say this cluster of gene pages on your site, they have the authority that you built over the years, but now it's also available for people in Denmark or Sweden, Norway, whatever it is. And we're gonna reassign that authority there. So that is a value that I think a lot of people are overlooking.
Right.
But on the technical side of it, I mean, the problem, as we both know, unlike HTML, that is a pretty unstructured format, Hreflang is a strictly structured format. And there's all structured formats. There's only two ways, the right way and the wrong way.
Right. And
we both see, there was an article the other day, I can put a link to it too, a big survey from Ahrefs that had called, what was it? They analyzed, I think, 400,000 domains and saw that lots of them, was 68% or something, that had some sort of problem with the Hreflang data. Well, that is, I mean, that correlates pretty well with what I experienced too, and I know you have the same experience. So what are the most common problems that you see sites are having with mutation?
I think, like you said, there's a protocol, right? And there's a right way and the wrong way is the exact way to say it. Is that one thing we still see today, almost 10 years after this has been live, is people misunderstanding the settings. So it uses the ISO country and language codes. And so one we see almost daily is people that think they can, like for Latin America, they have one Spanish language site and it's for all of Latin America. And they try to use the LA country code, thinking Latin America, because maybe that's what they have in their folder. Well, LA is for Laos. And you're basically saying, this is my Spanish language website for Laos. We see this with ME for Middle East. Well, that's not the Middle East. And so it's that's one that we see. Two, probably the next biggest one is, I think the way you set up Hreflang was correct. We have a page, and these are the alternates. This is my UK alternate, my English language UK, my English language Australia, because it is a language variation that you're saying, and we've been able to benefit from a country or a region association. If you're saying this is my United States English webpage and my English UK website and my Austrian German webpage, if you're saying that those are the three in a cluster, and I love the word cluster, then all three of those need to reciprocate, meaning on the Austrian page, we need to say, this is my UK English, this is my US English, this is my France French page. That's another one. People don't have those reciprocations. And that is a problem with using tags on a web page because your system may not be able to include them. And we do see a lot of people that are on, Shopify or Salesforce Commerce Cloud that because of their licensing may not have all the websites in one, so the system cannot bundle them. So they may have all the English, let's say, or all the North American bundled, but the cluster's incomplete because they didn't include Europe or they didn't include Latin America. So that's another big error that we see. And then probably the third biggest, and another one that the Ahrefs study showed was it's often incomplete. People may have it on their homepage, they may have it on a category page, but they often don't have it on a product page because either the complexity of implementing it or the lack of resources to implement it. And so it's only partially deployed, either because system problems or because of resource problems. So, and at the end of the day, if the cluster is not complete, then Google can't understand those two key elements. A, these are alternative versions, and B, each of these versions has a specific place or specific purpose. And without that specific purpose and without the stating it's an alternative, then exactly that's what happens. Google will then count it as a duplicate, and there's no duplicate penalty, but they won't show it. And so somebody searching in Mexico may actually see a page from Argentina because for whatever reason, Google saw it first. And there is, believe it or not, a difference between the price in Argentina and or the ability to purchase between Argentina and Mexico. And at this point in time, we still have these problems. And like you said, developers, another one we're seeing is where because of that requirement to have reciprocation, some developers think a canonical tag implies reciprocation. So the page, the primary page, if you will, they think they can use a canonical tag in lieu of an hreflang tag for that. Or even the crazier developer is assuming, well, I can combine the two. I can combine a canonical tag and an hreflang tag. Nowhere in the standards is that allowed. And so, those are the things we see. And what we tell people is, when you write your test cases, make sure that your developers haven't taken liberties, with this. And then I think another big one that we see in e-commerce is missing tags or links to a page that's been redirected or has been deleted. And for e-commerce sites, they're often told from an SEO perspective, if you're out of stock, then, or you no longer sell that, roll it up, redirect it up to maybe a category page or an alternative page. And so, your hreflang is still in place on all the other pages or in your XML sitemap, but the link doesn't exist. And so you start breaking these chains. And in effect, you're sending Google into really you're telling Google to visit these pages on purpose, but in some cases, 3/4 of the links are actually broken or redirected or 410. That's something other than a 200 indexable. And I think that causes a lot of problems because now you've explicitly told Google, these are alternates, go get them. But when they go to get them, they're encountering something other than the page they think they're going to get. So that breaks the whole cluster and breaks the whole chain.
Yeah. Now, I just want to clarify on a thing, because you said that lots of sites don't have a complete implementation. And just to be clear, what you're talking about is that part of the cluster is not included, so to speak, right?
Correct.
Because, you don't necessarily have to put all your content into a cluster. Let me just use an example. Talking about Shopify. theoretically, you could cluster things by SKU. That's a good thing because normally you would have very specific SKUs for different products. That's for the products. But then I'm, for example, I'm dealing with a client that have 17 languages on different Shopify installs, of course. And the SKU part of it, the products, is pretty easy. That's unique identifier. But then it comes to the blogging post. They do also some blog posts, but that's more randomly. They do something on the Spanish side and something on the English, and we can't really map that. So what I'm thinking for that side is we're probably just going to leave that out and focus on the products and the categories. And I guess that's going to be okay, right? As long as it's complete and there's no errors in it, it's okay that certain part of the content on the site is not included in the Hreflang standard.
Sure. What a lot of people will do is and remember, a lot of the cannibalization is not between an English language page and a German language page. The cannibalization happens, or with Google saying, I only need one of these, happens within a language, right? So that blog post, right? And we have this now where somebody said, the 10 tips for a dog in a thunderstorm. Right. And then that's, translated into, 18 English sites. And like many people on their blog will change that title or the headline, and then that's what the blog system will take. So it's 100% the same article, maybe some spelling differences. And they deploy that. And then they say, well, in Australia, it's not showing up, the US site, and they're not getting traffic. So we tell them, okay, then you can create the mappings for just where you have cannibalization. No. Or even more importantly, think about your naming convention, right? Instead of taking whatever a writer decided to write, give them a headline. The other thing you can do is similar to a SKU, you can create an article ID. Yeah. Right? If almost every article for people in this scenario almost start from a dominant market, right? They take an English one, they translate it to French, they translate it to Danish, they translate it to Dutch, Swedish, but it starts with one. So if you use that code consistently, we can grab that. But to your point, you really only have to obsess about it. And if you have limited resources, use it where you have cannibalization, because now you know those 8 English language URLs. You can use that to create your mapping for this particular article that you've gotten traction on, but that is a different a market. Then you can come back, and again, we tell people with limited resources, or especially with blogs, do your French and your Belgian French, your France French, Belgian French, Canadian French. Do the 3 Germans or 4 Germans. Do your English, do your Spanish. Because then you're giving those pages a purpose. And it's often easier to do than trying to do everything. So yeah, the right way to do it is everything. But if you have these technical difficulties and resource challenges, then at least solve for the primary cannibalization first.
Yeah, because that's from the cannibalization point of view, and you're completely correct. If I write a blog post about the best dog foods, stay in that space, the wording of that in my English version is going to be completely different than my Danish version, or my French version. So there's no issue in duplicate content in Google. The cannibalization is only between the languages, of course. But there's also the issue, as you also touched on earlier, on what is the best landing page. For example, in Scandinavia, we have the problem with Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian that are separate languages. And to a large degree, Google understands that, but not always. And especially between Danish and Norwegian, that is very close to each other. Sometimes Google show the Norwegian page to Danish users and the other way. And of course, people don't convert as well. Because we would rather, there's a reason we've made a Danish website for the Danish consumers and Norwegian one for the Norwegians. So we would rather have people that search in Google to actually land on the right version. So that's also what the Hreflang standard can help with.
Right. Absolutely. And then if you take that one step further, a product, right? If I do a search and I'm looking for, let's say, a particular brand, a model of Nike running shoe, or I'm looking for, a whatever, a Ford Mustang GT or whatever. When I do that query, there's no language qualifier. There's no location qualifier. So in theory, even if I'm in there with you in Denmark and I do that query, I may see a page from any market that's particularly good for that product. And so because of that, I'm able to, Google may show the best page, but with Hreflang, it's going to show exactly that. It's going to show that Danish page. It's even though my product query was, say, in English, it's going to show that.
Yeah, I think we had a short dropout.
Yeah, we had a brief pause.
Yeah, but I think that we can somehow edit the video together again.
So you're tilted sideways.
Yeah, and you tilted the other way, but yeah. But I think the recording is okay anyway. So I think that's gonna work. I also, talking about the technical. Let me just see here. Yeah, we're still recording, so that's good. Just touching a little more on the technical specifications. There's a couple of things. One of them is that you can implement this standard in two ways. You can embed it as text on the page, or you can build a separate XML site there. Mm-hmm. I do have my experience and preference, but what is your experience? What do you prefer?
So I'm obviously biased to XML sitemaps because that's what my tool produces. We've seen both can work equally well. Google says they both work equally well. The major pros and cons of each and why we went with XML is the bigger the company or the more versions of the websites, the more visits are required if we put it in the page, right? So this was our argument originally when Google put out the tags in the page. We said, let's say I'm Delta Airlines and I've got 100 language versions of Delta Airlines. Then that means Google has to visit 100 pages to find the reciprocation of those tags. Whereas if I did XML sitemap, Google just needs to import the sitemap in which all 100 times 100 are actually there. So meaning in the XML, my English is now mapped to all 100 versions. My UK is mapped to all 100 versions. And so Google can see the cross-relation immediately.
Yeah.
As opposed to, and can validate the cluster. That's the way we like to tell people. So It's all about how quickly Google can validate the cluster. And what we tell people, because we have people from time to time that use our tool as a bridge until their development team deploys it. Then what happens is when they, in the bridge time, like a lot of times the contract will end and they'll deploy theirs and they're like, Bill, what happened? Why did we lose a lot of our mappings? You didn't lose them. It's just Google hasn't got to them. And what we tell people is take everything you see that's been cannibalized, put it into a tool like Screaming Frog, use the Search Console API and see when was the last time Google visited those pages. And what you'll see, the last time Google visited was prior to deploying the tags. And we'll see in some cases, especially, I hate to say second or third tier markets, but less popular markets to Google maybe, those pages take longer to be visited. And especially if you did this through JavaScript, like a lot of people have been using injections using Tag Manager, in edge computing, which is like all the rage by the cool kids these days. Let's use edge computing. Let's not deal with the website. Let's inject it through Tag Manager, which means we've now put a JavaScript overhead. And so Google comes in, oh, it's JavaScript. I got to come back with the rendering engine. I got to render it. Then I can get the tags, and they've got to do that 100 times. And that's exactly why we like XML over it. So if you have a 5 market website and you can deploy tags we tell people to do that. Just do that, because now you're guaranteed to have that on every page. It's out there. 5 is not too many, especially if Google's getting all your pages. Great. It's set. You can leave it. You don't have to worry about it. If you're more than 5, especially more than 10, you may want to make sure, and there's no reason you can't do both. Have it in the page and have it, as long as they're the same.
Yeah.
Then
exactly.
you can deploy it. But that's the key. A lot of people may say, this is a German language page in the tag, but in XML might say it's Germany, German.
Yeah.
Right. And now you've got 2 competing signals to Google, and they'll often, you're at their mercy to pick and choose. So that's why we like XML, especially for bigger sites. The third is, as you alluded to, the way people deploy their CMS may not enable this to be done. And back to the point about CCTLDs, again, in some cases, if you're using, mycompany.co.uk and .de, those systems may not allow you to add tags because they're treated as a separate deployment of that CMS.
Yeah.
Or the people that maybe do a LATAM because of pricing. We're seeing now some systems, okay, everything that's US dollars, put in US dollars, everything in euro, put in this module, everything that's in, maybe this common currency in another module. And so because they're not interchangeable. And so it's interesting. We've got a number of people that have come to us because they've been using these pods like in Shopify. They come to us and we ingest the 4 pods, and then we do the resolution to combine the sites across the 4 pods and produce an XML sitemap that does this. So it's a very interesting way to leverage their system, but also enable across all the CTTLDs and the different pods an Hreflang XML on their behalf. So again, it can be very technical. And I think, as we've talked many, many times over the years, a lot of times when people are deploying markets, especially new markets, and especially through partners, they may not be thinking about a lot of these implications because we know how frighteningly easy it is. I can stand up Shopify in a couple hours. I can launch a new domain today, clone something, just simply mirror it. And now I've got, and I can use some sort of insertion to change price and size and language. And so because it's so easy to deploy markets, people often do this without thinking about the implications from a technical standpoint, from an indexing standpoint, from a findability standpoint, from an Hreflang standpoint. And I think this is creating problems that many times the people that deployed it never even considered.
Yeah, and that's very valid point. It's my experience as well. And also on top of that, I generally like structured data to be in a separate structured format in one file, instead of having it on individual pages. And also, of course, a couple of lines of Hreflang data doesn't take up that much space. But again, it's not something that the user actually needs. It only is something that the engines need. So why send it back and forward between the server and the user, for that reason.
Right.
But of course, it's a minimal impact it have. But talking about these inconsistencies, there's also lots of sites who, by nature of CMS systems, that automatically output some other language settings. There's, of course, the HTML language tag, and there's the Open Graph or Twitter, but there's the Open Graph language. And sometimes they don't match. Sometimes they have language country settings in the Open Graph, which is like the standard for that. And sometimes you also have that in the HTML language tag. From my personal point of view, I don't, it makes me feel a little uncomfortable because I don't like mixed signals. But in reality, I know Google is not using the HTML language tag. I think Bing still does. But of course, the Open Graph tag, I'm pretty sure none of the engines are using that. But still, what's your experience on these mixed signals?
Well, it is mixed, and I think that's why they don't use them, because, Google, because of Google Translate, and the translation API, they know what language it is. And I actually just wrote a blog post last week about what I'm calling a, what did I call it? Aspirational Hreflang, or meaning you deploy it in one language, English, let's say. So this is what we found. We found the company had 10 sites where Hreflang wasn't working. And it was like Greek. The pages were supposed to be in Greek for Greece. Exactly like I said, the language tag, the open graph tag, the Hreflang setting they did was all saying it was in Greek. The page was actually in English, which Google could detect. And they're like, well, if it's in English, we're not going to recognize these Hreflang tags because it's in English. And then we're like, why is, and we actually did the calculation because we used the API and we looked at what did Google choose. And they chose an English language page as the canonical 99.97% of the time. Right? Like, why did they pick English? It should be Greek. There is no other Greek. And we looked at the pages and they were all in English. And it was a setting in the CMS where they were supposed to be Greek, but they were actually output in English. They decided to leave them in English. So when we changed the Hreflang to English and Greece, then Google started picking them up because now we were honest with that. So back to this thing. Here's an interesting thing. If you deployed your site in a CMS that's especially if the CMS is from a market, and I've been meaning to test this. So we take the Swedish one, starts with an E.
Yeah, I forgot the name too. I know exactly.
It's probably good that we're not giving the name. Okay, but even WordPress, right? So we find this, and I'm not going to say what markets because again, I'll get hate mail that I'm picking on, let's say Germany. But if you deployed a site in WordPress from Germany, 9 times out of 10, even if it's a US English language website, your language tag is going to be DEDE. And the reason is your build of WordPress from your host, especially if you used it built by a host, they're Germany, so they're going to set it to their default. Yeah. The same is true if you deploy from a US host, the default setting is going to be US English. Even if you then, put it into German or French or Japanese. Same thing in Japan. If you deployed WordPress from a Japanese host, 90% of the time, even if it's in English, it's going to say that it's JAJP because the assumption is you deploying it from that market, it's Japanese. And so that's a big thing we see, and nobody ever thinks, let me check that. And so we do see that's a big thing because everything is wired for it to be JAJP or DEDE because that was the source code that you deployed it from. And so we see that with CMSs that are popular in a particular market, like Drupal. Agencies, we see this a lot with agencies in France that are using their build of Drupal and they deploy it from France. And even though it's a multilingual website, almost every version of it's in FRFR. So this is why Google has decided not to use those. Bing does, but Bing does also do a great job of detecting language and will supersede that. And I think, so we got to think about these things. And there are a lot of SEOs that argue, well, I have a country language tag in the heading, so why can't Google just use that? Well, because when I did a study back in the day at IBM, we found about 95% of them were actually wrong. So because of that, it was a problem. So.
Yeah, and that's exactly the problem. My point with this as well. So I mean, staying consistent is at least a good advice. I have had the same issue with Shopify. Not afraid to mention names here, even though I love Shopify in many ways. They have been messing around with Hreflang a bit. I experienced it on my own. I do ceramics, and I have a website where I shop on Shopify where I sell it. And when they launched Markets, a way to deal with multiple markets within one install, it wasn't that good. I haven't touched it since then, so I have become a little better. But I have the website. I'm from Denmark, so I'm a Danish business. But because I sell globally, I decided to sell in euro, because the Danish krone is tied to euro. So instead of using US dollars, it was better for me. Which is not so uncommon. And I think also Canadians and Americans are used to buy in Europe as well. So that should work. But then when I implemented Markets, or I ticked it on in Shopify, they decided my site was German. And not only did they put hreflang-tags for German language, but also for Germany. So they targeted both German language and German markets, which essentially would mean that Americans wouldn't find my ceramics when they search English, which of course is terrible. So I turned it off again. And so you definitely have to be aware of what your CMS is putting in as default and check it out, which I know for non-technical people can be challenging, but there is tools like your Hreflang-builder that can help analyze this data. So, and speaking from also, because it can be difficult to overview, especially on a big site, to see that everything is mapped out the right way, but it is super, super important. You helped me out with a case 2 years ago, a big Danish producer of engineering material that suddenly woke up one day on the American side. They had an English, American, German, UK and Australian English, and the most important market, the American side, went completely out of Google. And you remember that case.
Yep.
We're not going to mention the name here because that would be appropriate. But it was basically almost down to a single comment that was wrong. It was a very, very small but important thing. So those little details are important.
Yeah.
And once you helped fixing it, back into Google. And not only that, they actually increased the traffic in Google because the previous implementation was not good either. And now they got correct implementation and they actually gained traffic for it. So thank you for that. And they, of course, were very happy. But speaking about these little details, there is, as some of you out there might know, there are two elements of the standard. You can specify the language, and you can optionally specify the country. And then you can also specify an X default, which means that if Google can't match it to any of your sites, they will show this version. But that, of course, introduces a lot of complexity that I'm often dealing with. And sometimes I'm not even, you could do either of that, and I'm not always 100% sure what might be the best. But I mean, do you recommend people always use an X default? Because, for example, let's bring up an example. I'm just a sign of a client. They have a German site and a Danish site. And so, with Hreflang, that's easy enough. But I'm not really sure what I put in an X default, because what should that be? For most people in the world, neither German or Danish is going to work for them anyway.
Right.
So that's going to be a little bit complicated. What do you think about that? And in what cases would you use language, and what cases wouldn't you use? Not language, but country. Of course, we always have to use language. But in what cases wouldn't you use the country definition?
So I think addressing the hreflang, I mean the X default in hreflang. So what I recommend is, one, if it was originally deployed, if you had a language selector, a country language selector, and that was the default page. So if you go to, like, I think FedEx still has that. You come there, before you can go forward, you have to pick a country or a language. It's like a gateway. So that's what you would set for X default, and then Google would show that to everybody that's there. The second option I use it is when people, like in IBM or in HP, they have a default global site. Absolute Vodka does this. They have a global English site that acts as sort of the default site for a market. So let's say you don't have a site for Fiji or New Zealand. Then that's the one that by using an X default, you're saying this is the one we want you to show. Again, the idea, here's my default site, my fallover site if I don't have one. The other one that we're doing a lot more is people that have a mysite.com homepage that uses a 301 with an IP detection switcher to the appropriate site. We'll often set that page and only that page, the hp.com, as the X default, because then because Google's going to show that, because in many cases, because of the 302, it's still a valid page, and because of all the backlinks and all that stuff. If you have two languages that are not spoken widely, I'd recommend not using it, because what is the fallback? Do you use German because maybe more people speak German than Danish? It's not necessary. But interestingly enough, a lot of tools will flag you for not using an X default. That was an interesting thing that was actually in the Ahrefs study, was saying,
exactly.
And they do quantify it. It's not required. It's not essential. But they were exactly saying that, the majority of the sites didn't have one. And they did have that exclusion. So that's what we tell people. Language. So one of the things we do when we onboard somebody is we have them create a country language matrix. And we simply ask grown-up questions to say, okay, in your scenario of a Danish site and a Germany site, is that a Germany site or is it a German language site? And so if it's a German language, meaning you also want to target Austria and German-speaking Switzerland and anywhere else where they speak German, or Germans about in the world, if that's your objective, then I would recommend you set that to German language.
And not
the interesting thing about and not DEDE, because if you set it to German language, Germany, you're implying that this is specifically for Germany. Where you would do that is if you also had an Austrian or you had a Swiss German version, because then you're explicitly saying that. Again, some of the detection testing tools will do exactly as you said. Oh, we found you had a DEDE. Why didn't you roll it over? And what a lot of people don't understand is there's potentially legal implications of setting it to German. Because if I were a lawyer and I was suing somebody in Austria, I could infer that by you setting it to German meant that you were actually targeting Austria. If you set it to DEDE, then you've narrowed the confine. Now, Google can show that anywhere it wants. You can't control where Google's. But if you did say this is DEDE, well, it doesn't restrain you to only people that are in Germany. You have explicitly said this is for people in Germany that speak German. It's not necessarily for Austria. It's not necessarily for Switzerland. So from a legal perspective, and I think a lot of people that built detection tools, they don't have a master's degree that included international law. So, so that's exactly why they tell you to do this, because they don't think about the legal implications. And those are the decisions. Now, if you did make a decision, so somebody like Skype, for example, Skype only has a language only. IBM has just moved to language only, meaning they have one German, they have one French, they have one, Italian. So they're going on purpose saying this is a German language site, and they want it to be represented there. So these are the decisions, and this is why even when you deploy, like we're telling people before you launch in your first market, forward think, are we going to launch a Spanish speaking and target 26 markets that Spanish is the official language, or and can we support them? And so when you set up your country language matrix, you're saying, okay, this site, that has this purpose today. It has this language support, this currency support, and ability to sell to these markets. What setting do we want to use? And I think when people approach this the right way, instead of just simply coming in and, okay, I want this to target anybody in the world that speaks German or Danish. And that's an SEO mentality as opposed to a logistical or a legal or a operational mentality. Then that's how you want to make these settings.
There is and going back to your mentioning of the geo-targeting and redirecting, I can't speak for legal aspects all over the world, not even completely for Europe, but I do know that in Europe specifically, there is an issue with this. According to European law, you're not actually allowed to limit the access to a site by IP, but you are allowed to only market your business somewhere. So I'm allowed to market my Danish website only in Denmark. It doesn't make sense for me to market it, but I'm not allowed to block German visitors from accessing my Danish website. So there's a distinction between that. And of course, that makes total sense. Whether or not Hreflang and Google would be considered one or the other could be a legal discussion. I won't go into that. But my logical sense would say that there would be nothing illegal from restricting Google's ranking of pages to a specific country in Europe. But that definitely would be a problem with it if you physically got some European visitors to access your site. We have some laws against that. But again, it's very complicated, and I'm not a lawyer, so I just want to mention that small part of it. But I think we got much of the Hreflang issues covered. I will say that the good thing is that lots of CMSs are now offering built-in tools for managing this, because it is machine code, and I have always had the idea that if you build something for machines, it should be made by machines. Trying to manage this manually is impossible. That's going to go wrong. So it's nice to see that more and more CMSs offer built-in functionality. If you're on WordPress, I would highly recommend WPML. It's a good framework to work on, and it works well. Also, more and more tools for other platforms are coming out. Not all of them are perfect, but hopefully they will get better over time. And if you don't have these tools, or if the tools are not perfect, then of course I want to recommend again your tool, hreflang-builder.com, and go there. It's actually very affordable, and it is working. So at least you get the experience of you and the quality of your tool to get the thing data. And so I don't know if you want to end with anything, but I think we covered so much in this session. That was very good. It was wonderful to talk to you as always. So I do expect that we will have some more talks over the next weeks or months or so, because there's a few more things that I would like to pick your brain about. Sure. So hope to see you soon again, and hope that all you viewers will come back and see some of the other SEO talks. We will bring in other kind of old school experts, because I'm an old guy, so all my friends are very old. We're bringing some of the expertise, and will be fun. So have a great day, all of you, and
you too. Great, thank you. Enjoyed it.